Welcome to the What If It's Not Depression podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein, and today we are going to talk about sleep with the sleep whisperer, as she's called. She has a podcast by the same name, and Deepa is an allied functional medicine practitioner, author, and yogini in her practice, Phytothrive. She combines therapeutic and transformational yoga with nutrition based on the principles of functional medicine. She merges the science of the functional world with the deep symbolism of the ancient wisdom of Ayurveda or Ayurvedic medicine. The rare genetic disorder known as salt-wasting congenital adrenal hyperplasia of her son gave her insight into the workings of the adrenals and the stress response as it relates to all health and sleep. Her book will be released by HarperCollins in April of 2023 on this topic. Great to have you here. And if you like this episode, click on the like button and subscribe. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Deepa. It was great. It's great to have you here. I know we had to schedule a couple times, and I'm glad we finally put it together.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy I was invited by you, Achina.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I really was interested on your topic of sleep because, lots of people know about, quote, what we call sleep hygiene, and they try to practice sleep hygiene by changing certain habits in their lifestyle. But I don't think that they know about all of the things that could potentially affect sleep, which your book will talk about in more detail, certainly, but I would love for you to give us a sort of a primer of what it is, some of the things that people don't think about. But let's start with your story. I really love to hear people's stories about what even got them involved in these areas. And I know that you had some experience with your son. I would love for you to start there and let us know more about that and what that is that the condition is, more details about that, and how that leads to sleep issues as well as obviously adrenal issues.
Yeah, sure. So, Achina, I was married for about 8 years in my previous marriage, which was difficult and like any bad marriage, and 8 years of almost sleeplessness every single night and anxiety. And I know that this is a show about mental health, so that was an experience that I really don't want anybody to have, being in a marriage which doesn't work for you, and losing sleep every night for 8 years is no joke. Anyway, fast forward, eventually I broke off from that marriage, and then I met a fellow yogi. My husband lived in a Himalayan cave, and then we met each other at a yoga center, and we got married, and then we were both older parents. And when my son was born, we had no idea. So when he was 3 weeks old, he started to have a little bit of vomiting, and this went on for about 12 to 20 hours, and stopped feeding, stopped urinating, and before my eyes his skin turned dark and he shriveled up. And then we ran into the emergency room, and they whisked him away and put him in a little cubicle inside the NICU. And several hours later, they said that your son has an adrenal disorder. And my first question was, is he going to die? And the doctor said, no, we caught it just in time. You came to us when he was at the end of an adrenal crisis, where he had sodium which had crashed and potassium which had spiked.
Wow.
Had you come a few hours later, he would have died.
Wow.
But they said that he will live. He will need to be managed every single day. He'll be a steroid dependent child because his body doesn't produce cortisol and aldosterone. And we can talk about these a little more detail because they both play so many roles. And cortisol, we're all familiar with in terms of how as an age we are spiking cortisol all the time in high stress, but we don't really think about a child coming into the world without having cortisol, which means he doesn't have the resources to cope with any kind of stress that he faces. So he's steroid dependent. He has 2 steroids, one to replace cortisol, one to replace aldosterone. And if someone doesn't produce aldosterone, if I'm sure your listeners must be aware, but aldosterone is what regulates sodium potassium levels. So in Omkar's case, the condition is called salt wasting congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which means he throws out salt. So they lose copious amounts of salt, and the body cannot hold sodium, and therefore they can go into a crisis and die in a few days if they're off steroids. So they need these two steroids. And think about any situation where we lose salts, such as vomiting, diarrhea, viral, anything. All these situations means that he has to be in the ICU. He has to have triple dose of steroids to just get over a simple fever that children can just go through. And there can be potentially fatal situations in several situations. So this is how he was born. The first year I was just running into the emergency room almost every third evening because of a seizure or because of adrenal crisis. And it is not, when we talk about adrenal issues today, yes, they play a big role in health, mental health, sleep, all of it. But in these kind of pathogenic conditions, it's not as simple as just affecting your body's inflammatory response, but it means that these kids can die in any kind of a situation.
Wow. That must have been very frightening for you to deal with, especially after all the stress you went through with your first marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when did you start exploring other avenues of improving his health?
Well, I think he was 5 or 6 when I started to question why is he always, every year there'd be 2 hospitalizations, ICU. And then I asked the doctor, is there something that we can do with food? And typically you hear that food doesn't play a role in these things. But I just started to feel that what if we could at least reduce his stay in the hospital. Not that we're hoping for a cure, because this is a pathogenic condition and the medication is something they need to survive. But by supporting the body in different ways, maybe we don't need to be hospitalized quite so much.
Right.
So that's how I started just studying nutrition. And then, quite by destiny, something about functional medicine popped up on a browser, and then I was just attracted to it. And China, it's been about 6 years. He's, touch wood, not had a hospital stay. He's still on steroids, but he's not been hospitalized.
And he hasn't been hospitalized for how many years now?
6 years.
6 years. Okay. So you
Yeah.
started the changes 6 years ago, and ever since then,
Yes.
so he's about 11 now. Yeah.
Yes. No, he's
Awesome.
actually about 12. Yeah.
12. Yeah. That's great. Great. Yeah. So tell us, what is it that you did? What were the changes that you made?
Well, I think initially I went down the route of removing gluten, reducing sugar, reducing the dairy, which wasn't so practical much later, because in school lunches are served which are predominantly gluten and dairy. But he's actually come to a state now where those things don't really affect him as much. I think it's a lot to working with just increasing the protein he gets, be it a clean protein shake at some time of the day, making sure that when he's at home at breakfast and dinner, that he's including some amount of vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, colorful vegetables. And then there's a little bit of, like any child, having a bit of negotiation that you do this for me, I'll do this for you. So we do give in a little bit, but
Right.
keep some of the basics going so that his blood sugar is stable, because he knows that blood sugar stability is key to adrenal health. And focusing on liver detoxification with castor packs, because the steroids are a toxic load. While you cannot be without the steroid, you do understand that you need to support the body in some way to detoxify this, and also perhaps utilize the medication better.
Absolutely. And I love the way you talk about it, because you're, accepting the need, obviously, for him to be alive, the steroids. That doesn't mean you can't do other things to support the body in utilizing the benefits of the medication, while, implementing different methods to avoid all the risks that can come with steroids, especially. Steroids can actually cause significant mood swings and depression and mania. So it's pretty severe for some people, and many people actually avoid steroids for those reasons. But when you have to take steroids to live, then it's certainly, what you're doing is great for your son. Awesome. So how does sleep come into play for you? How did you get into knowing more about sleep? Is this also related to your experience with your son?
Well, I think, Achina, first of all, in my first marriage, I was awake a lot because I was in this heightened state of stress, and there would be very loud shouting, and I would always feel I wasn't safe in that room to fall asleep.
Mhm.
So I'd only go to sleep when my ex-husband fell asleep. So that kind of set the motion that I had poor quality sleep, and what we talk about today in functional medicine as this heightened adrenal overdrive or dysfunctional HP axis. I didn't realize all of that back then. But then, even when my son was born, those first few years, because we were running into the hospital at odd hours, it was also kind of an emergency situation. So I'd
Sure.
always lie in bed and I'd be watching him. I'd be expecting a seizure, or I'd be expecting something to happen. And I'd always preempt it by not falling into deep sleep, because I feel if I miss that, something's going to happen. So it's only in the last few years that I started to improve my sleep. And I must say that there are still certain triggers that disturb it quite a bit, because I feel those of us who face some kind of trauma over life, we seem to, any little stressor can tip us over. And I
Mhm.
later learned, Achina, that carriers of this condition, which my son has, CAH, is so the carriers who are me and my husband, and the carriers can have poor detoxification of cortisol, which means that when we have a period of high stress, we might take longer to metabolize that cortisol than somebody else. So there are times that even today, if I get something which is very disturbing, it can take me a few days to calm down. And I have to be very mindful and intentional of the practices that I do. And one of the big ones for me is that I turn off everything by 6 p.m. and I don't allow any kind of input from the senses to enter me after that, as I don't want to spiral into that stressful spike.
Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's almost like a PTSD type of reaction that you've had from your
Yes.
experiences. Yeah. And many people with PTSD have those experiences, which can absolutely affect sleep significantly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, so let's talk about how you interweave functional medicine with Ayurveda in terms of improving your sleep. What are some things that you can tell us about in terms of root causes of sleep that maybe other people aren't familiar with? There's so many things that people are familiar with in terms of causing problems with sleep, like caffeine being a major cause, screen time, alcohol, cigarettes. But there are things that some people aren't aware of at all, and may not, they might do all the right things, but still not be able to sleep. Can you talk about some of the things that people aren't aware of?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about the overview of my book because that gives a lot of perspective. It's actually written from a framework of the 10 senses. So I'm not sure if anyone's familiar, but in Eastern ancient wisdom, in a lot of texts, there's the talk about the 10 senses. So
Mm-hmm.
we're familiar with our five senses, which are
Mm-hmm.
sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. But in Eastern wisdom, there are five more senses, which are the sense organs, which are the genitals, the rectum, the hands, the legs, and the mouth, which means the other five senses are our sense of detoxification, our sense of reproduction, meaning in terms of hormonal behavior, locomotion, meaning how is movement associated with sleep. Then there is how is the nervous system, and then how is the thyroid. But
Mm-hmm.
so if we look at these 10 senses, I used it as a framework in the book to explore how could we look at root causes of Ayurveda and functional medicine, and how can that be interplayed with each other. So for example, one of those is we might be familiar with sympathetic dominance, the imbalance in the autonomic nervous system between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. But what is that in Ayurveda is, Ayurveda describes that each of us in our body has these three energies, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And these combine in different ways in all of us. So you might have more Vata, less Kapha, I might have more Pitta. So this is how we arrive at our body constitution, which is a bit like the blueprint, like how we talk about in functional medicine. But Ayurveda talks a lot about sleep disruption as heightened vata. Now, what is vata? Is that vata aggravation correlates to adrenal dysfunction and sympathetic dominance. And vata's qualities are that it's dry, cold, which means that certain foods which are dry, cold, which can include cold smoothies, cold salads, raw foods, airy, crunchy, dry foods, something which is movement disrupts vata. So, like traveling constantly, and someone who's vata aggravated will tell you that I can't stay in one place. I want to keep moving. I love to travel. And that's actually the imbalance talking. So
Mm-hmm.
it's when this vata is aggravated, it's when sleep gets disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
So while in sympathetic dominance, we might be told that you need to calm down, you need to sit and meditate, you need to slow down, you need to allow your body to shift into the parasympathetic state. That's not always as simple as telling you to go and wind down, or just as simple to tell you go and sleep. So how do we do that? How do we make that shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic? Is by calming down vata energy, which is this energy of dry and cold. And one of the most powerful ways that we can do that is to counter the quality of dryness with oil. So which means oiling the body from neck to toe in an abhyanga. And I do that 7 days a week today, Achina, and my
Mm-hmm.
sleep has never been so good. And it's
Wow.
just from that, no sleep supplements, nothing else. It's just calming down the nervous system, calming down this vata through oiling.
Wow.
So that's one of the ways that I wrote about this intersection. But there's another these five senses that I mentioned earlier, which probably we're not so familiar with, for example, the sense of detoxification.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that, yes,
Can I ask you a question? What oil
yes.
did you use? What oil?
Oh,
Which
yes,
oil?
sure. So we can talk a lot because Abhyanga is such a powerful tool, and the oil varies, Achina, because based on the body constitution, based upon the season, based on our age, all of it, it can vary. Typically, if somebody is Vata dominant or has Vata imbalance, then you're looking at warm sesame oil, which counters that. It's got a heating quality, which means that you don't really you counter the cold quality of vata. So we're looking at warm sesame oil if the
Mm-hmm.
person is not sleeping, or even if the person is living in a place where it's cold or dry. Then anywhere, so if you live in a place which has dry weather right through the year, you're more likely to get vata aggravation.
Mm.
Similarly, Achina, menopause is a vata age in life, which means that when women enter perimenopause and menopause, they have a natural tendency for vata to be disrupted. So we
Mm.
want to use warm sesame oil, and we also want to apply the oil in a way where we calm the 5 vayus or the 5 energies in the body in a specific way, where you start going up and down the hip to calm down what's called apana energy, then down the left leg, down the right leg, circular clockwise around the belly button for samana, which is what we talk about as gut health being the center of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Then up and down the chest to improve breathing, then up and down the left arm, right arm, and down the back. And then we just soak in this oil. We give about 15 minutes. And Achina, one more aspect of this is that if we've got this vata overdrive or sympathetic dominance, the way we apply the oil will be vigorous and fast. It won't be calm and smooth. So if we're more intentional that we want to slow down even the movement of the strokes, that's all going to calm us down. And from the perspective of functional medicine, what are we doing? We're soothing our sense of touch. So we are lowering cortisol, we are boosting the release of oxytocin by that massage. And there's a lot of research to correlate this release of oxytocin with oil massage. And then we
Mm-hmm.
just soak it in, counter this quality of dryness. And I would still say if somebody doesn't do anything else, just begin with the oil massage and you'll improve sleep so much.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love everything that you just said about that. I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about the use of oils, to help people sleep. That's awesome. Yeah. So you were about to start saying something before I interrupted
Yes.
you because I was so interested in what oil you use. What was the next thing that you were going to mention?
Yeah, I was just talking about the sense of detoxification, which is, if we look at certain through the lens of functional medicine itself, we've got these SNPs, like for example, a COMT, where we are not able to metabolize and detoxify catecholamines like adrenaline, and then therefore, if there are those who have this genetic variation, then under stress, they're not able to calm down as easily because they're not able to detoxify these stimulating hormones.
Right.
And in Ayurveda, the same thing is spoken about as pitta being out of balance. So pitta is when the liver gets upset, when you've got this someone who's getting irritated all the time, someone who's grumpy, loses the temper easily. These are all signs that pitta's off balance, and it can show up even as symptoms like skin rashes or heartburn, or and the other correlation, Achina, is Pitta imbalance in Ayurveda looks a lot like a histamine spike,
Mm.
and histamine spikes there's a lot of research to show that it disrupts sleep. And when someone has got this big spike of histamine, if they're histamine intolerant, they can disrupt sleep for several days. And that's exactly what pitta imbalance looks like. They look so similar to each other. And
Mm.
so it all goes back to how do we improve our sense of detoxification, which goes back to how do we take care of the liver. And here's something, Achina, I know that there's a lot of talk about the crucible cruciferous vegetables in terms of helping with liver detoxification, but in Ayurveda, too many of the cruciferous vegetables, when they're not balanced with sweeter vegetables like sweet potatoes or carrots, they are supposed to increase vata again in the body, which means it disrupts sleep. And vata and pitta have this relationship where the air element of high vata behaves like a fan, which makes the fire of pitta blaze higher. So vata imbalance leads to pitta imbalance, and pitta imbalance, that hot fiery nature of pitta, can in turn dry up the body excessively, leading back to vata imbalance. So if someone has vata pitta body, or they have one which is off balance, it's very likely they'll have imbalance of the other. So in Ayurveda, the answer is usually not to overdo the cruciferous vegetables, that they should always be in balance with sweeter vegetables, provided somebody doesn't have other challenges such as being insulin resistant or pre-diabetic, where they might need to reduce those sugars.
Right.
But typically in anybody else, it is recommended that there's balance of the flavors, the 6 tastes, where sweet, sour, salt, bitter, astringent, and pungent, they're all there at every meal.
Right, right. So the cruciferous, just so the audience, just to remind the audience that the cruciferous vegetables are broccoli and cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and so the sweeter vegetables, you mentioned sweet potatoes and carrots. What else is in that list?
Yeah, there's beetroot, there's squash, there's pumpkins, all these sweeter vegetables, and these are called augmenting or nourishing vegetables. And the leafy greens and the cruciferous are called extractive or cleansing vegetable. Extractive because they make the body give up something of itself to digest, so they're a bit harder, so they're a bit cleansing. And if you look at the energies in the body, the sweeter vegetables create the energies below the waist, so the earth and the water element, and above the waist, the air, the ether in the chest, those are built by the other tastes. So it's required that we need to have balance of all of it in order for the energies or the pranas in the body to stay in a state of calmness. And of course, these tastes are also a bit more tricky, because at times when we're in a state of imbalance, we'll usually crave the tastes that further trigger the imbalance. So for example, when vata's in a state of balance, people will crave the sweet, the salty, and the sour. But when vata's in a state of imbalance, which is typically seen as poor sleep, they might crave more of the pungent, more of the bitter, more of the astringent. So astringent are just things like shrink up the body. So for example, the ones which dry up water in the body. So for example, in Ayurveda, if someone were to drink cold raw green smoothies every day, that they might end up with vata aggravation and disrupt sleep.
Absolutely. And I've seen that happen, actually. I've seen that happen.
Yes.
So by balancing it with some of these sweeter foods might actually help with that. That's great advice. I love that. I love that. Yeah. So what are some other things that that can aggravate or cause sleep problems other than what you've already mentioned, which are great tips and great connections between food and also with ways to address them with the oils, bathing the body on a daily basis, even with oils. What are some other things that you can enlighten us about? I know I mentioned to you that some people don't think about is hypoglycemia, having a bottoming of blood sugars in the middle of the night that then puts the body into an emergency state. And I see that happen often, and some of the factors that can happen during the day that can put a person in that position.
Great question. Yeah, that's a super question, Achina. And that also gives us context to talk about how waking waking up at different times of the night tell us different things. And it's not just about waking up at night. For example, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. is kapha time of the day. So which means it's the energy of lethargy, and we want to ideally go to sleep during kapha time, which means we need to be in bed before 10 p.m. Now 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. is pitta time, where pitta uses its power of transformation to rejuvenate the liver. Now if we stay awake past 10 p.m., pitta comes up for what's the second wind, which is what we call about the second wind in adrenal overdrive as well. Right. So when pitta comes up for the second wind, we have too much of thinking, we get hungry because pitta is fire. And vata time of the night is from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. So now if we are waking up somewhere before 2 a.m. in the morning, then it's pitta time, and that can be a lot to do with blood sugar disruption. That can be a lot to do with not feeding the fire the right way where it stays satiated. But waking up from 2 a.m. onwards, when it's vata time of the day, can show that there's vata imbalance. So these times also play a big role. But coming back to blood sugar, yeah, absolutely. And it's very critical, and I always reiterate my statement, Achina, that the magical sleep plate begins at breakfast. So you hear a lot of these articles and podcasts about the great sleep dinner, what to eat, the tryptophan foods, but what we do at breakfast decides how we're going to sleep at night. So if we're going to be disrupting blood sugar in the morning, it's not as simple as eating something at dinner and hoping that it stabilizes. So we need to begin at breakfast. And in Ayurveda, the saying is that Agni, which is the digestive fire, has a bell curve, which means it's low in the morning, it's fiery at noon, and it starts dropping by evening. Now, this might be a bit counter to certain other aspects about the heavy breakfast, but in Ayurveda, the recommendation is that make the noon meal your biggest meal, where it's feeding the fire. But you do want to start the day with optimal protein. So that's the time of the day I like to do easier to digest proteins, but still keeping in mind that we need to have optimal protein at breakfast to begin that blood sugar stability. So more in terms of maybe a plant protein shake and a lighter meal, but then when we come to lunch, we want to feed the fire in a particular way where we create stable blood sugar for the rest of the day. And that can look like, unless somebody has sort of insulin resistant blood sugar issue, otherwise we do want to have a little bit of the whole grain, where there's balance between the whole grains are again nourishing foods or augmenting foods, and then the proteins are considered extractive foods. So some kind of a balance between these two, and then also balance between the sweeter vegetable and the cleansing vegetables. And one of the ways that we make sure we get all this tastes into a meal is to use spices, where spices bring in a lot of other tastes. So we want to begin with that optimal protein, but easy to digest, this solid lunch, and then dinner by around sunset, which is similar to lunch, but with easier to digest ingredients, so that it just keeps Agni calm. It's fed the fire, but it's not causing any kind of gut distress. And there is a very antagonistic relationship between Agni and Vata. So, which is what I think is like a gut-brain connection, because when Vata is high, Agni is weak. And when Agni is weak, Vata is high, which means if digestive function is poor, suboptimal, then we can have more chances of having anxiety. And Vata's emotion is anxiety. So one of the ways that you'll know that Vata is off balance is if you get anxious. And then anger relates to Pitta. So by looking at these emotions, they also tell us which of these energies is off balance. So if we eat in this manner where we keep Agni stable, so we are eating with the biorhythms of the diurnal rhythms of light and darkness, but and eating the right food at the right time, where we feed the fire, we keep blood sugar stable. And in Ayurveda, blood sugar stability is very much linked to how strong is Agni, the digestive fire.
Mm.
So if we have strong Agni, we have better ability to be beyond cravings, to have stable blood sugar, which means if we go to sleep at night, we fall asleep and we're not going to wake up with a drop in blood sugar, which then spikes cortisol. But then it all goes back also to the appropriate time that we go to bed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a combination of things that need to be put in place in order for you to get a good quality of sleep. So tell me more about the hours of 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Is that also blood sugar related, or are there other things that affect?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a sign that Vata is off balance. And other symptoms of Vata imbalance are that we'll get anxious. So, which means if we wake up at that time, we're going to, every problem in our day is going to magnify and look like this big, scary monster.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sign that when we wake up between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. is that, I mean, I don't mean if we are waking up at 5 a.m., that's perfectly fine. But when we are waking up in the first part of this Vata time, it shows that we are having this nervous system imbalance or adrenal issues. So we're just not able to calm down the nervous system. It's not allowing us to stay long enough in a parasympathetic state. And one more aspect, Achina, is that in yogic tradition, we've got this left nostril, right nostril, and these left nostril and right nostril, they are the ending points of the nadis, which correlate to the autonomic nervous system. So the right nostril correlates to sympathetic nervous system, and the left nostril correlates to the parasympathetic nervous system. So typically in the night, for us to stay asleep, we need to be having the parasympathetic nervous system a little more active.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that we can manually do that is we can lie on our right side with the left nostril facing the ceiling to activate the parasympathetic state. And that will calm down our mind. So that's one of the things that works beautifully for a lot of people who struggle with sleep issues and waking up at that time, because their mind is hyper alert.
Mm-hmm.
So you turn on to the right side and make sure that the left nostril is facing the ceiling. And you can also manually check. So you can just close a nostril and you blow out through the other,
Mm-hmm.
and then you check which one is stronger at that moment. For example, in the middle of the night, you're lying awake and you find that your right nostril is more active, then
Mm-hmm.
that's telling you that you're sympathetic dominant. So immediately turn over to the right with your left nostril up and give yourself about 5 minutes, and that energy will take over. And then you'll start to calm down.
Hmm. Wow, that's really simple. A simple tip to really test out right away, and it doesn't
Yes.
require much else. That's awesome. So, I know we're running out of time. I would, if there's anything else that you think that would be really important to tell our audience now, you've told us so many great things already that I haven't had anyone else talk about on my podcast. So if there's anything else that you can think of, I know that you've talked about with me the bidirectional bio-individuality of sleep. I don't know if you wanted to mention that now in the short time that we
Yeah.
have left. That would be great.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it's just that the reason use those two words a lot is that I found that even though there were a lot of people in the health space talking about sleep, they were still general recommendations, and they weren't looking at, are there physiological root causes which are different for you, different for me. We're not all having sleep disruption because of the same set of physiological root causes. Now,
Right.
yes, we talk a lot about how poor sleep causes issues, but can we tell somebody who's having certain physiological root causes, just go and sleep? It's not as simple as that. So I started to look into, are there certain body types? Can we divide people into some sort of vulnerabilities where they can understand which systems are off balance? And that's what I've done in the book a lot. And
Mhm.
so the bidirectionality comes from the fact that several of the root causes of poor sleep can also be symptoms of poor sleep. For example, low progesterone in women, whether it is at a reproductive fertile age or whether it's perimenopausal. So poor sleep obviously is a stressor. It raises cortisol, it drops progesterone, and women
Right.
in the perimenopausal age are already dropping progesterone. But so it's bidirectional. When they're not sleeping, it's leading into this pattern of stress and poor hormones. But certain age or certain phases of the cycle where we have low progesterone, that becomes a root cause for why we're not falling asleep. So there's this bidirectionality going on in so many ways. I mean, it's such a vast topic. Maybe we should go
Right.
talk
Yeah.
about that maybe closer to the book or something like that. But
Right.
I'd come back to saying, Achina, that my recommendation always is simplify rather than complicate. And I know that there's a lot of talk about supplements, sleep supplements, including CBD oil or GABA. And my go-to is never, not even to the melatonin. And it's always to what can we do which is non-invasive. And I must share this with you, Achina, because yesterday I was telling a new client for the very first time about oiling and using warm sesame oil. And I was joking to my husband later that he looked at me like I was cuckoo. So, when you make these very basic, simple recommendations, people don't believe in them. And most often, because we're on this search for complex, we want to be reassured that it's something which we haven't discovered for ourselves. And that's not always the case. I just advise, in fact, I was going to create a little challenge that where people don't take any sleep supplements for 30 days and all they do is oil their body every single day. So let's simplify, let's not complicate. Um, don't follow the loose recommendations of anybody. However great something worked for your friend or family, it's not going to be the same for you because our bodies are so different. And too many sleep supplements are also a load on the liver. At some point, if someone already has challenges with detoxification, it's just going to cause further disruption. So
Absolutely.
we don't want to go down that route. And one last thing I must share, Achina, because I think it's really important, is that there's an antagonistic relationship between vitamin D and melatonin. And a lot of times, if we are given high dose vitamin D, like the 60,000, which is prescribed a lot, for someone who has either genetic variations that affect liver detoxification or pitta imbalance, they are not able to metabolize these high doses of vitamin D, which can lead to sleep disruption that looks like high anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd really caution against that high dose. The second is that in the research for my book, I discovered that there is this antagonistic relationship, which means if even the low dose vitamin D is taken in the evening or at night, it's going to shut off the release of melatonin for about 12 hours. So if
Mm-hmm.
we want to have natural melatonin release at night to help us with sleep, we should be taking vitamin D supplements in the morning.
Right.
And that's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, those are great additions to great tips and I completely agree with you. Those high doses are not even necessary. I tend not to give doses above 10,000 without doing regular blood work.
Yes.
But giving in the morning is absolutely right with food. With
Yes.
food, yes,
Yes.
yes. Well, Deepa, it's great to have you to talk about sleep and how functional medicine is interweaving with Ayurveda. I love everything that you've said. I really appreciate your time. And I know that you are sharing a free guided meditation with whoever wants this to help them try to have them sleep. There are so many meditations out there, and I think it's worth trying different ones because sometimes one might not click for you and another might click for you. And I just want the audience to know that if they wanted to find you, they could go to your website, phytothrive.com, and that you are on Facebook and Instagram. The author of it's author Sleep Whisperer on Facebook and My Sleep Whisperer on Instagram. So great having you, Deepa. I look forward to getting your book and reading it and learning more about these topics.
Thank you, Achina. It was a pleasure to be here speaking with you.